In this episode, I'm talking to health expert Chris Kresser on why conventional medicine is doomed to fail for treating chronic disease, what the replacement form of medicine is, the new paradigm, as well as lots of great specific content on things like veganism versus omnivory, low carb and keto, as well as things like adrenal fatigue. Enjoy. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Energy Blueprint podcast. I'm your host, Ari Whitten, and today I have with me Chris Kresser, who is a globally recognized leader in the fields of ancestral health, paleo nutrition, and functional and integrative medicine. He's the creator of chriskresser.com, one of the top 25 natural health sites in the world, and the author of the New York Times bestseller, Your Personal Paleo Code, and this book that I have in my hands right here, Unconventional Medicine. So welcome to the show, Chris. I've been following your work for many, many years, and it's a pleasure to finally have a conversation with you.
Thanks, Ari. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah. So unconventional medicine, that's the topic of your latest book. In this book, you talk about why conventional healthcare is destined to fail. And there's three specific reasons that you give in the book as far as why that is. Can you talk about kind of the overarching paradigm here and context of why you think conventional medicine is destined to fail?
Sure. Yeah, it's really quite simple, actually. Chronic disease is the biggest challenge we face today from a healthcare perspective. 1 in 2 Americans have chronic disease, and 1 in 4 have multiple chronic diseases. And 7 of 10 deaths are now from chronic disease, and 86% of the nearly $4 trillion we spend on healthcare every year in this country goes toward the treatment of chronic disease. So it's pretty clear that that's the main issue that we're dealing with. But conventional medicine, although it excels at dealing with acute emergency problems, so if you get hit by a bus, you definitely want to go to the hospital. It's lousy at treating chronic disease, and it was actually never set up to do that. And so this is why we're seeing costs just getting out of control. We're seeing more and more people with chronic disease not getting their needs met in the conventional healthcare system and having to look elsewhere, to address their problems. And, there are a lot of estimates that suggest that if healthcare expenditures continue to grow at their current pace, which are largely driven by chronic disease, they'll consume the entire federal budget by the year 2040 or thereabouts. So we'll have nothing left over for education or infrastructure or anything else. So another way to put it is that we go bankrupt, basically, as a government. So I think the stakes are pretty high in light of that, and it's incumbent upon us to do something about it as soon as we can for our own sake, but more importantly, for the sake of our children and future generations.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said. One aspect of sort of the conventional allopathic paradigm is, I'd say is at the heart of it is kind of this paradigm that says, like, if we look on a smaller and smaller level, and we go down to the microscopic level, we go down to the genetic level or the biochemical level and look at hormones and biochemicals and different, kind of molecular pathways, cellular pathways, we're going to find some particular pathway or biochemical that is abnormal, that is associated with some particular condition. And once we discover that, then we can create a drug that modulates that biochemical pathway in such a way that it is curative of that disease or at least relieves the symptoms. Yeah. Do you think that paradigm that is driving most of allopathic medicine and most of the research that's being done by pharmaceutical companies, do you think that paradigm is fundamentally bad and poorly suited for treating chronic disease?
I think that paradigm has specific applications that can be very useful in certain contexts, but to assume that paradigm applied in a general sense to the problem of chronic disease is going to be fruitful is misplaced. And unfortunately, this is related to what I was talking about before. Our current medical system really flows out of a dualistic Cartesian philosophical framework that is very reductionist by nature. So as you pointed out, we're trying to reduce things into their smaller and smaller parts. And the assumption is that our body is really just a collection of these parts, you know, whether we're talking about large parts like an arm or very small parts like a cell. And if we understand the parts, then by definition, we understand the whole. And that's actually just been shown to be false in many different ways. And it ignores the holism of an organic and biological system like a human being. And there's a lot of really good, you know, the science has evolved, and our understanding of these kinds of complex biological systems has evolved in the past 100 or 200 years. But unfortunately, the medical paradigm has not caught up, and is still very much based in that reductionist view. And we see it everywhere. I talked about it recently in a podcast debate that on Joe Rogan that maybe we'll come back to. But it's, you know, in the context of nutrition, it's that we've been obsessively focused on macronutrients like carbohydrate and protein and fat, and micronutrients, doing studies on beta carotene or vitamin A, and the risk that those carry associated with mortality or morbidity, instead of focusing on the things that really matter in the diet, which is the quality of the diet, the quality of the kinds of fats and carbohydrates and proteins that we eat, and the quality of the nutrients that we eat. So I think that paradigm certainly can be utilized, you know, for example, if you're doing research on a drug to treat a particular condition, or cancer research or something like that. But it really falls short when it comes to the interventions that will make the biggest impact on preventing and reversing chronic disease.
Yeah, absolutely. So one other aspect that I want to get into, you address this to some extent in your book, is, you know, kind of this idea that many people within conventional medicine have, many MDs have, also many skeptics or many people in the general public who kind of have this idea of everything in conventional medicine is backed by a huge amount of science, and everything that is not accepted within conventional medicine is sort of by definition not scientific or a pseudoscience. And with the idea being, if it were backed by science, as soon as there's evidence supporting it, then it's automatically sort of incorporated into conventional medicine. And, you know, I forget the phrase, but it's something like, hey, if alternative medicine that actually has science behind it, we just call that medicine.
Yeah,
right?
No longer alternative. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So what do you say to the person who has that assumption of conventional allopathic medicine as being really evidence-based, and the idea that certain things outside of that, like, for example, functional medicine, which we're going to get into and you're a big advocate of, is not evidence-based?
Yeah, I'd say that that's demonstrably false. And, you know, we can use just a few examples. So one would be PPIs, which are the drugs that are used to treat acid reflux and GERD. They were only ever approved by the FDA for short-term use of a couple of weeks. And yet there are many people out there, probably many who are listening to this show, who have been taking them for years, if not decades. And there's no research to support that. There's a lot of research actually that shows that long-term PPI use can cause a shockingly diverse range of problems, from increased risk of kidney disease to increased risk of infection, because stomach acid protects us against infection, to nutrient deficiencies, some of which can be highly problematic, like B12 deficiency, and can mimic the signs and symptoms of dementia and Alzheimer's in the aging population that is taking these drugs. So that's a use of a drug that's not evidence-based at all. Similarly, antidepressants are prescribed in off-label ways all the time that have never been studied, and in populations like children that have never been extensively studied, and where safety data has never really been clearly established. And what data do exist actually suggests that there's an increase in suicidal ideation in that population, and some other and that those drugs may cause changes to the developing brain that could become permanent and lifelong. So those are just two very basic examples, but there are many that I go through in my book. And it's certainly true that many conventional treatments do have research behind them, but it's not true to say that all of conventional medicine as we know it is well supported by conventional scientific research, nor is it true that functional medicine is not supported. So the problem with asking the question, is there any research to support functional medicine, is that's like saying, is there any research to support conventional medicine? We're talking about entire paradigms. And if you go into PubMed and you search for conventional medicine, you're not going to find very many studies on the topic of conventional medicine, just like you won't find studies on the topic of functional medicine. Functional medicine is a methodology or an approach that is based on identifying and addressing the underlying cause of a problem instead of just suppressing symptoms. So if we use irritable bowel syndrome as an example, if a patient has IBS and they have diarrhea, they're going to get prescribed Imodium. In the conventional model, they might get analgesics or antispasmodics for the pain. They might get an antidepressant. And yes, there are studies to support some limited efficacy in terms of symptom reduction for those treatments. In functional medicine, we're going to do a breath test to see if they have SIBO, because there are studies that show that SIBO can be a contributing factor, bacterial overgrowth in the small intestine for IBS. We might test them for undetected parasite infections or disrupted gut microbiome, because those have both been connected with IBS. We might look at the HPA axis to assess the gut-brain axis dysfunction. That's definitely been validated as a driver of IBS. And then we might use treatments, botanical protocols to eradicate the SIBO, which have been validated in the scientific literature, or treatments to address the HPA axis dysfunction, also in the scientific literature. So in the same way, there are lots of studies to validate the approach of functional medicine. They're just not called functional medicine study.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's part of the confusion and why people think there isn't any research to support it.
Right. Yeah, I think it's worth emphasizing. You mentioned a couple examples within conventional medicine where there are drugs being prescribed. And you literally just mentioned two of probably, I'm guessing, maybe dozens of examples that you could have given, where literally millions of people are being treated with drugs where there is literally no evidence in that particular context to support that particular.
Huge experiment. We're doing uncontrolled scientific experiment with potentially, life-altering consequences and without anyone's explicit informed consent.
Yeah.
Is one way to put it.
Absolutely. So how does functional medicine become better or more efficient and effective in actually solving some of these chronic disease issues? And I know you just covered a bit of this in passing, but can you give a couple of examples of where a functional medicine type intervention is going to just be vastly superior to what someone would get in conventional medicine?
Yeah, I think the IBS example is actually a really good one. Another is any kind of autoimmune disease. So we could talk about a patient with Hashimoto's, which is a autoimmune condition where the body starts attacking the thyroid gland, and then they eventually develop hypothyroidism. And in the conventional model, what happens is the patient goes into the doctor once they've already become hypothyroid. So the autoimmune attack in that case has probably been going on for years, if not decades, according to the research. That autoimmune process begins decades often before clinical symptoms happen. So they weren't properly screened in the first place. Then they go into the doctor once they're already hypothyroid, and then the doctor determines that they're hypothyroid, and they prescribe a thyroid hormone replacement medication like Synthroid. And that's the end of it. And then usually the patient will go away. The drug might help for a little while, or it might not help. And then they might go back to the doctor, and the doctor prescribes a higher dose, and maybe that works for a little while, and then it stops working. And then they go back to the doctor and they get a higher dose. And then at some point the dose they're taking is suppressing their TSH almost to zero. So they can't go up anymore on the drug, and they're feeling kind of wired and and not good on such a high dose of the drug, but their original symptoms haven't been addressed anyways. So why is that? Well, because in conventional medicine, they're looking at the symptom. In this case, which is poor thyroid function, is a symptom of immune dysregulation, or the autoimmune attack is the underlying cause. But that's not even tested for by most doctors in the conventional model, much less treated or addressed. So in functional medicine, if someone comes in with hypothyroidism, we're going to test their thyroid antibodies. If they're producing high levels of thyroid antibodies, then we say, oh, this is a problem with the immune system. It's not a thyroid problem. It's a problem with the immune system that happens to be affecting the thyroid. So yes, we might need to give that patient thyroid replacement hormone, but we can't only do that. We have to actually balance and regulate the immune system so that the thyroid stops attacking, or the immune system stops attacking the thyroid gland. So how do we do that? It's kind of two phases. One would be to identify and address any triggers that could exacerbate immune dysfunction or cause immune dysfunction. So those could be things like GI issues. I mentioned some of them when we were talking about IBS, SIBO, gut infections like H. pylori, or parasites, or leaky gut, intestinal permeability, disrupted gut microbiome. Could be HPA axis dysfunction. Could be nutrient deficiencies, particularly selenium, iodine, and zinc. Could be other kinds of latent chronic infections. Could be other hormone imbalances, et cetera. So we look through all of these things that could be contributing. And then once we've addressed those things, if the immune system hasn't already just snapped back into normal function on its own, we can take additional steps to balance and regulate the immune system. And that means that, in some cases that could eliminate the need for medication at all. But in other cases, the patient still needs to take medication, but they usually need a much lower dose to achieve the same result. And they don't continually have to keep upping the dose over time because the immune attack has been reduced or stopped. And that is what stops the progression of the condition over many years. So it's really, again, the difference between just trying to put a kind of a Band-Aid on the problem and really addressing it at the root.
So on a big picture level, and kind of on a financial level, almost on a national scale.
Yeah.
One of the things you mentioned with regard to why conventional medicine is destined to fail is that the cost of, how much it's going to cost the nation to take care of all these sick people is going to be so high. Just to be clear, how does functional medicine, if it's implemented on a broad scale, how does that solve that financial issue?
Well, to be clear, I think that's still a question that hasn't been fully worked out. And, but I'll give you an example of what that could look like. So we know that the cost of treating a patient who already has type 2 diabetes is about $15,000 a year. And that's just for that one condition and its complications. It's not unusual now for a diagnosis of type 2 diabetes to be made in mid 30s or even early 40s, and it's just getting younger and younger every year. And because of our that conventional medicine does excel so much at heroic interventions, pretty far along the disease spectrum, it wouldn't be unexpected for someone even with type 2 diabetes to live now until they're 75 or 80 years old or even older. So let's just assume conservatively that someone gets diagnosed at 40 and they die at 80. That's 40 years, or at $15,000 a year, $600,000 over the course of that patient's lifetime, just for that single patient and that single disease. Now, if we use a functional medicine approach, it's true we might need to spend a little bit more up front. So what that would look like is doing testing earlier along that disease spectrum to screen that patient when they have prediabetes rather than full-on type 2 diabetes, because we know that the earlier that you intervene with blood sugar issue, the greater the chances are that you can completely reverse it without having to use medication. So if we caught that patient by doing some screening earlier on, they would cost a little bit more money. And then we used a collaborative care team that includes a nutritionist and a health coach, which we can talk about more, to actually give meaningful, real support to that patient to make the diet and lifestyle changes they need to make to reverse the condition. That's another big difference in the model that I'm advocating. So that's actually baked into it. So again, that would cost a little bit of money up front, but let's be just super generous. I don't think it would cost this much, but let's say it costs $10,000 to do that testing and employ the health coach and the nutritionist, and let's even throw in a personal trainer and work with that patient for a year to totally, revamp their diet and lifestyle habits so that they not only go from pre-diabetic blood sugar to normal blood sugar, but now have the tools that they need to prevent that from happening ever again in the future. I would say, and I think most people would agree, that a $10,000 investment to save $600,000 over the course of that patient's lifetime is a pretty good return on investment, right? So it's totally feasible. It's just a question of having the political will and the ability to shift our current system in that direction and to deal with the powers that be that are invested in maintaining the status quo and may not be interested in supporting these types of changes.
Yeah. I want to play devil's advocate for a minute, because I'll preface by saying that I completely agree with you. Mm-hmm. But I do think that there are a couple big obstacles. One you just mentioned is, kind of the powers that be, and pharmaceutical companies more interested in maintaining the status quo. They stand to lose billions of dollars, obviously, if the kind of practices that you're talking about become commonplace. So obviously they don't want that to happen, and the shareholders in those companies don't want that to happen. But also on an individual level, aside from any sort of, big picture corporate level corruption or influence, we have just individuals. And in this culture, a lot of people are resistant. They maybe don't want to change their diet, and they don't want to go to the gym and work out with a personal trainer. And they want to continue eating how they're eating, and they want to take a drug, or maybe in the future, there'll be some other advanced technology intervention that they can use that maybe provides some level of symptomatic relief. And they'll say, oh, that's primitive to, change my diet and start exercising. I just want to pop this pill every day, and that helps me manage my blood sugar. And that sort of no effort, quick fix solution has a lot of appeal. So how do you overcome that level of obstacle on an individual level?
So for the first example with Big Pharma, you're right. They're not going to like it, and they're not going to go along with it easily. But I think it is instructive to look at how other countries deal with this issue. We are, along with New Zealand, the only two countries in the world that allow direct-to-consumer drug advertising. Pharmaceutical companies charge way, way more for their drugs in the US than in any other country in the world. Those are political decisions. So if the political will is there, we as a people can put some guardrails around what pharmaceutical companies are able to do in this country. So I'm not saying that that's going to be an easy fight or that I have all the answers there, but I think it is valuable to look at this issue in virtually every other industrialized country. It's not the same. Mm-hmm. As far as the individual question, I think it's also helpful to look at other industrialized countries that they don't have the same level of problems that we do here with obesity and diabetes and many other chronic health conditions, although they're certainly on the rise in those places as well. And it's also instructive to look even 50 years back in this country when the rates of obesity were far lower than they are today, when people were getting an average of 7 to 8 hours of sleep pretty regularly, and only maybe 2% were getting fewer than 6 hours versus 35% today. And yes, there have been significant technological and societal level changes that have contributed to these shifts in behavior. But my point is that there can be new shifts that can actually contribute to supporting different types of behavior. And those shifts can happen either voluntarily or involuntarily. So I think if there was a pill that solved the problems in the way that you're suggesting, like if someone could take a pill and, just experience perfect blood sugar and no symptoms and lose all of the weight they wanted to lose and that would be a tough battle to win, because we're fighting against very hardwired biological programming in our brains, where human beings are, we conserve energy as a default, because in a natural environment where we had to be active a lot, it made sense to conserve energy when we could. We're also drawn to eat highly calorie dense and rewarding foods for a similar reason. We evolved in an environment of food scarcity, and the ancestors that were most successful in seeking out those very calorie dense foods are the ones that passed their genes on to us. So that backfires, of course, when you can go to Costco and there's a 7-Eleven on every corner and a fast food restaurant in every town. But I do think that through public health policy, education, and proactive changes that we can make. We're only spending 3% of our federal healthcare budget on public health, and we spend 86% on treating chronic disease. So we could set up a healthcare system that really focuses a lot more on supporting people in making diet, lifestyle, and behavior changes right from the beginning, even from the time when kids have their first interactions with the system, and is focused a lot less on drugs. These are big changes. They are at the level of, maybe not quite the level of like what's being asked of us in terms of climate change now. Whatever your views, there was a report that was just issued that outlined some ideas of how we need to respond in order to prevent, significant outcomes there. And I don't think it's quite at that level with this issue, but it certainly would require a huge effort and a huge reorganization of society. But similarly, with climate change, we're not really going to have a choice. Like, the way that chronic disease is exploding, I use that example of how much it costs to treat one person with type 2 diabetes. Well, guess what? 1 in 3 Americans now has either prediabetes or type 2 diabetes, 100 million people. And all you have to do is some quick math to figure out that expenditure to treat 100 million people, if they eventually develop type 2 diabetes, is, that's game over. That's, we even that one condition could bankrupt this country. So the writing's on the wall, and we can either make these changes proactively, or we can wait essentially until the system falls apart and then react to it. And, different people will have different ideas about what outcome is more likely based on, I think, their viewpoint, their overall viewpoint.
Yeah. I have one more layer of this that I want to play devil's advocate, which is, part of what you're preaching, which I love, obviously, is that you're trying to get at root causes. Mm-hmm. Now, even within that, let's say some of these examples that you gave, like, conventional medicine versus functional medicine, and the way that they would deal with something like IBS, or the way they deal with something like Hashimoto's. You, as an advocate of ancestral nutrition and lifestyle, know very well that I think the real solution, that if you actually want to solve this health crisis and the chronic disease epidemic that are going on right now, if you actually want to solve it in a way that really dissolves the financial burden and the health burden of this and all of the suffering, or, a huge percentage of the suffering, is to fundamentally overhaul, our nutrition and lifestyle from the beginning of life.
Yeah.
And that's obviously a huge undertaking that I don't think anybody has a really good answer as to how to actually accomplish that. But that is, fundamentally the only way to really address things at a root cause level. Would you agree with that?
I would. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I would say that sometimes the changes don't necessarily need to be as dramatic as we think they do. So, for example, in the nutrition realm, you have what we might conceive of as an ideal diet. And there's, of course, a lot of controversy and disagreement about exactly what that is. But if we just started with, like, let's eat real food, mostly fresh whole foods that don't come in a bag or a box, that would probably get us 70 to 80% at least of the way there in terms of the gain or the benefit that we could get from nutrition. I think Michael Pollan had a good way of approaching that with his second to last book. I think the one on just cooking at home. You know, like if you cook at home, you're just much more likely to eat real foods. Now, having said that, even that, of course, is a big undertaking when you have 60% of the calories that Americans get in their diet are now currently coming from ultra-processed and highly refined foods. So just asking, you know, moving from that to even just a whole food, real food diet is a big undertaking. And then, of course, you have all of the socio-political issues. You know, there are lots of people living in food deserts in inner city urban communities that don't really have access to fresh whole foods. And there's the question of economic resources. And again, you know, I don't think we've come anywhere close to figuring out how this is going to happen on a society-wide scale, but we need to keep asking these questions so that we can continue to brainstorm together and figure out what the best approach is. I think just my bias is that it's going to happen more on a grassroots level and a bottom up way than it is a top down way. And I already see a lot of encouraging changes in that regard. We still have a very long ways to go.
Yeah. Excellent. So, well, I love what you're preaching. On another note, I want to transition into talking about some specific kind of health issues and specific controversial subjects within the field of health and nutrition. One thing I really appreciate about your work is a commitment to stick to the evidence and to let evidence guide your views. You don't go along with fads and trends, and you actually look at the evidence on specific subjects. I'll give a couple brief examples. You know, there's the grain brain thing, kind of the blaming of neurological disease, you know, on grains. And I know you have an article where you've you know, kind of systematically analyze some of those claims as to whether the evidence supports that or not. You've also done some analysis around low carb and the insulin hypothesis of obesity, and a number of other subjects, also adrenal fatigue, which I hope to get into with you. That's also a passion of mine where I've spent many months exploring the literature, and it's a fascinating topic, as I know you know. So as one segue, you mentioned earlier your recent podcast on Joe Rogan, your recent interview with Joe Rogan, where you had a debate with Dr. Joel Kahn, who's also a friend of mine and has been actually on this podcast a couple times. And it was sort of a vegan versus omnivore debate. Obviously, I don't have Joel here today, so I want to ask you, I guess, if you can, and this is a big task, but maybe summarize kind of the essence of the debate by like giving maybe what you feel is the most compelling evidence in support of the vegan argument, and maybe the most compelling evidence, you know, in favor of omnivory.
Yeah. And I mean, I say this genuinely, like if I thought there was really compelling evidence supporting the vegan argument, I probably wouldn't have done that debate. I think if you mean compelling by like at first glance, when looking in the scientific literature, you can see that there's tons of observational studies that suggest that switching to a vegan diet will improve your blood lipids and lower your blood sugar and reduce inflammatory markers and lead to weight loss, et cetera, et cetera. And that's all true, but you have to consider what they're comparing against. And in those studies, you know, in almost every case, they're comparing a vegan diet against a standard American diet where people are eating crap processed food. And I don't deny that a vegan diet is going to be an improvement over that diet and will have all of those effects. My fundamental point in that debate is that that's not a good way of answering the question, are animal foods beneficial in the context of a healthy diet, which I think is the question that is the really important one to be asking, because nobody that I know is arguing in support of the standard American diet of eating hot dogs and, you know, fast food cheeseburgers and that sort of thing, which is what most people eat. We know from the studies. The question that I'm interested in is, are animal foods beneficial and not harmful in the context of a whole foods, nutrient-dense, anti-inflammatory diet? And my core argument was that not only does research, we don't have a lot of research comparing those diets, but what we do have suggests that animal foods are not harmful and in fact may be beneficial because of the higher potential of nutrient deficiencies on a vegan diet that are not always ameliorated by supplementation, even when vegans are aware and are supplementing. So I would say that was my core argument.
Yeah, I will encourage everyone to also listen to it. It was a fascinating conversation, and that was an amazing job of summarizing, I think it was over 3 hours.
Almost 4 hours, yeah.
A 4-hour conversation. I think you just summarized the essence of it in about 2.5 minutes. So well done. So another issue that I want to talk to you about, you've been an advocate of paleo and ancestral diet and lifestyle for a long time now, 15 years, something like that?
More or less.
Yeah. There's been a weird there was a weird marriage of paleo nutrition with low carb, and the low carb sort of insulin hypothesis of obesity. That carbs and insulin specifically are the factors that drive fat gain, and sort of Gary Taubes's stuff and Atkins stuff. Yeah. More recently, kind of a marriage with the keto movement.
Yeah.
I'm curious as to your thoughts on low carb and keto, and maybe why they got sort of mixed up and married to paleo, and what you think, should they be married or should they be treated as separate concepts?
Yeah, definitely separate. I mean, if you look at the evolution just from a 30,000 foot view of these dietary approaches, paleo was first introduced as a concept, as a nutritional concept or framework by Boyd Eaton and Lauren Cordain back in the 80s. And what they were talking about was not a low carb keto diet at all. And in fact, when you look at the ethnographic studies of extant hunter-gatherers that were still around in the 20th century, early 20th century and mid 20th century in some places, there were many studies done of these groups that found that the macronutrient ratios varied, of course, from place to place. Intake of carbohydrates was much lower and fat was much higher in the Inuit, for example, simply because they didn't have access to carbohydrates for large portions of the year. They would absolutely have eaten them if they had access to them, but they lived in a very marginal environment. Likewise, then you had on the other end of the spectrum, you had the Tukasenta in Papua New Guinea, who got like 97% of their calories from carbohydrate, mostly just eat sweet potatoes, and the little bit of protein and fat they get was from the insects that were on the sweet potatoes that they were eating. And same with the traditional Okinawans, very high intake of carbohydrate. But generally, the basic, average carbohydrate intake for most hunter-gatherer groups was somewhere in the 30 to 45% range. So absolutely not what most people would consider a low-carb diet. And then I think later in the 90s and certainly into the aughts, the earliest adopters of the paleo approach came over, I think, from Atkins, and looked at it as more of like a real food alternative to Atkins, because Atkins kind of went the way of like lots of packaged and processed, Atkins kind of, I would call frankenfoods that, as long as they were high fat. As long as they were high fat and low carb, doesn't matter what's in them. It's again, that reductionist approach and the downsides of that way of looking at things. And so the Atkins early adopters came over into the paleo camp, and then paleo started to like move more and more in the low carb direction. And then you had a lot of people who were interested in weight loss, who were, of course, had done the Atkins thing, and now who were coming to paleo. And I do think a low carb diet can actually work really well for weight loss for many people. And so I think then that became something that further drove it in that direction. And then when keto came onto the scene more recently, that's of course an extreme low carb high fat diet. It also works very well for weight loss as well as some neurological conditions. And it just kind of pushed it further over. And in my conversations with people recently who are not really part of my field, I'm noticing that keto is being used interchangeably with paleo and some, by some people and in some contexts, which really shows that, in terms of the general population, there's not a clear understanding of what the difference is. So
I've even heard people actually refer to a paleo ketogenic diet. And like you said, they're kind of using paleo and ketogenic as synonymous terms.
Right.
What's interesting is, to my knowledge, there doesn't seem to be any hunter-gatherer tribe that's studied that is actually in ketosis. And I think even the Inuit were found not to be in ketosis.
No, because there's different ideas about why they aren't, but not typically in ketosis. And even if they were, it wasn't voluntary. like I pointed out, it was a function of living in very marginalized environment and not having access to carbohydrate. Mm-hmm. So, again, 30,000 foot view. I think that we can start with ketosis and move backwards. Ketogenic diets. A ketogenic diet, in my mind, is a therapeutic tool, and it, as a tool, just like any other tool, it has some really great uses. But in the same way that you don't use a hammer for every other thing that you need a tool for, I wouldn't suggest using a ketogenic diet to solve every problem. But that's kind of how it goes with fad diets, right? If it works well for weight loss and it works well for neurological problems like epilepsy and even Alzheimer's and dementia, then it must work well for my problem, whatever that problem is. And that's often how it starts. And there is some interesting research in animals. For example, there was a new study that just came out in mice, so big caveat there, that showed that ketones reduce the certain processes involved in aging, and that's interesting. I think from an evolutionary perspective, it's likely that most of our ancestors and even contemporary hunter-gatherers spent some short periods of time in ketosis as a result of being in a fasted state when there was some kind of food scarcity. Mm-hmm. And I do believe that there are certain processes that happen in the body, like autophagy in a fasted state, or when ketones are produced, that are beneficial in that cyclical fashion. But to extend that to the idea that we should always be, all people should always be in ketosis, and that's that there's any precedent for that, or even any evidence to support that that's safe or beneficial for most people, is a real stretch, to put it lightly.
Mm-hmm. That was very diplomatic.
And that doesn't take away from the ketogenic diet's incredible potential and impact on conditions like type 2 diabetes and the neurological disorders that I mentioned, and traumatic brain injury, perhaps, and many other things that are still being elucidated. Mm-hmm. But it's really much better to understand it as a tool than a kind of default way of eating, I think. As far as low carb, I think most of what I would have just said for ketogenic diets kind of applies there too. I mean, I would say that I think it's, in some cases, probably quite safe for someone to follow a low carb diet for the rest of their life. And there are more examples of cultures that were closer to that. And just mechanistically, I think that an argument could be made for someone with type 2 diabetes, for example, who can control their blood sugar without medication by following a low carb diet. And as long as they're eating real nutrient dense foods and eating as broad a variety of foods as possible within that context, I think, I don't see, and doing what they can to nourish their gut microbiome, which is one of the potential downsides of perhaps of a long-term low carb diet, then I think you can make an argument for that. But again, I don't just automatically put every patient that comes to me on a low carb diet, because there are some people who will be harmed by that, and some people who will do better on a moderate carb and perhaps even in a high carbohydrate and lower fat diet. So my fundamental point, which I didn't mention on the Joe Rogan show, that I actually started off with, was that the nutrition research and health understanding in general has been incredibly harmed by this idea that is tied to the reductionist philosophy that we talked about earlier, that there's one size fits all approach that will, one diet that will work well for everybody. And let's just put all our resources in trying to figure out what that one diet is. How much carbohydrate should everybody eat? How much protein should everybody eat? How much fat should everybody eat? And we've been asking the wrong question for so many years, which is why everyone is so confused, and why we still don't have an answer. Because if you ask the wrong question over and over again, you don't get the answer that you're looking for.
Yeah. On that note, there was even a study published by, or not a study, but an opinion piece that came out from some obesity scientists a few years ago. That was a call to end the diet wars. And it was basically noting like, hey, we have dozens of studies comparing low carb to low fat at this point. And it's pretty clear if you take an honest look at the evidence that there isn't one amazing diet that is the fix for obesity. And most of the studies that are long-term and well-controlled don't even show remarkable differences between low carb and low fat approaches if the diets are actually adhered to. And so it's like, hey, we need to stop. We need to end the low carb versus low fat debate. This is clearly not the answer.
You probably saw this study. I think it was 2016, late in 2016, the Gardner study out of Stanford. It was a fantastic. I mean, I wish we had more research like this. They explicitly set out to answer this question the way that they designed the study. They took two groups of people who wanted to lose weight, and they put one group on a lower carb diet and one group on a lower fat diet. But the difference was they explicitly advised them to eat, in both groups, to eat nutrient-dense whole foods. They had some good techniques for making that more likely. And just as you pointed out, after a year long, both groups actually lost significant amounts of weight because they were eating real foods and not crap. But there was very little difference, maybe a slight advantage in some ways to the low carb group, but very little difference between the two groups. So that goes back to what I was saying before. If we just ate real food, we would get 70, 80% of the way there, and then you can kind of do any fine tuning that needs to happen after that. But I think the point I've often made is, and I think I mentioned this in the article about grains being the problem, the cause of of brain problems and stuff. I know Dr. Perlmutter. I have deep, great respect for his work. I think he's made amazing contributions, and I agree with him on a lot of things. And I imagine he'd probably agree with what I'm about to say, which is that I don't think people eating quinoa or, brown rice is driving the epidemic of Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and neurodegenerative diseases. I just don't. I think if people were eating whole foods that included whole grains, we would not be seeing the increase in those conditions that we're seeing now. I think those conditions are driven by processed and refined carbohydrates like flour and sugar. And there's really no evidence that I'm aware of that's compelling that suggests that whole grains are contributing to these problems. And even in my first book, which had the word paleo in the title, it was really not a paleo book, because I was saying that full fat dairy products are beneficial when they're well tolerated, and that even grains and legumes in moderation can be part of a healthy diet if they're well tolerated. And nobody liked that book. Lauren Cordain was really mad that book had the word paleo in the title, because he said this is not a paleo diet. And then of course, people in the vegan vegetarian world didn't like it because it had animal products. So, that's just, that came out of my research and my experience about what works best for most people. Well,
I know the feeling of being in no man's land with some of my intellectual positions on the subject of nutrition as well. Mm-hmm. It's actually an interesting segue. I was actually just about to ask you that exact thing about, for example, legumes and dairy and grains, which are traditionally outside of sort of the keto list the paleo list of good and bad foods. And yet, there's layers of evidence that have come out that's saying, hey, like, we have anthropological evidence showing that some of our ancestors did eat grains, and legumes are pretty unequivocally associated with health benefits in the literature. Why are we avoiding these as if they're devil foods? So your take on that is kind of sort of modified paleo. if you want to call it that, which is that like, hey, let's also look to the evidence. And if the evidence supports benefits of a particular food, let's include it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'll be perfectly frank. I've said this many times. Like if I could go back in time, I probably would take the word paleo out of that book title, because it's really, Lauren Corday was right. It's really not, I'm not advocating necessarily a strict paleo diet for everybody. And it's not that I have a problem. I mean, of course, I think it works really well for a lot of people. And I do, in my clinic, the way we do it is when someone comes in, if they're dealing with a ton of health problems, which they always are when they come to see me, nobody comes to see me for a sniffly nose. We say, try this for 30 days and let's see what happens. If you get a lot better and a lot of your symptoms go away, great. And then if you want to add back in legumes and full fat dairy, I actually think that's a pretty good idea because it makes your diet more diverse. Legumes can be a fantastic source of fermentable fiber, which is really important for our beneficial gut bacteria. Full fat dairy is a great source of bioavailable calcium, and all of the literature suggests that, the vast majority of studies suggest that it's inversely associated with metabolic and cardiovascular disease and obesity, probably because of the beneficial fats in the dairy, like conjugated linoleic acid. If you eat pasture-raised dairy, it's got meaningful amounts of vitamin A and other nutrients that come from the grass that the cows eat. So I say, add that back in. Let's see what happens. If you're able to add that back in and you don't experience any resurgence or recurrence of your symptoms that went away when you did the paleo reset, the full paleo diet, fantastic. Lucky you, enjoy those foods as part of your diet. But, for some people, when they add those foods back in, they start breaking out again, or they have digestive problems or whatever. And even then, we try to say, okay, well, let's see if there's something we can do to, let's test you for SIBO. Let's do this. And maybe after we treat those problems, you will be able to tolerate those foods again. So my mantra is always to eat the broadest, most diverse diet that your body will tolerate, because if there's one difference between our modern diet and our ancestral diet that's not talked about a lot, it's the variety of foods that were consumed, particularly of plant foods, the number of species. Most Americans eat about 4 or 5 vegetables, like lettuce, tomato on a burger, broccoli, carrots, and maybe one other. And
ketchup counts as
right. But if you look at, again, some of these anthropological studies, you see a lot of hunter-gatherer groups eating, anywhere from 40 or 50 different species of plants to upwards of 100. So that's a really big difference in terms of the exposure to different nutrients, and not only for us and our benefit, but for the benefit of the gut flora that need to be healthy. So yeah, I've never been a strict paleo zealot, because I don't think the research really supports that.
Yeah, there's a lot we could dig into that. I think a lot of different rabbit trails we could follow there. But I know you have a hard cutoff in about 5 minutes, and there's one more topic I wanted to ask you about, which is adrenal fatigue. And you've done some debunking in this space. I've done some debunking and some very extensive analysis of the research in this area, relevant to the concept, I should say, because as you know, there's really no research on adrenal fatigue specifically. Yeah. But what is your take on adrenal fatigue?
It's a made-up diagnosis, in short. So, the idea is that your adrenal glands get really tired and they can no longer produce cortisol. And then that is what leads to all of the symptoms. The symptoms that people describe and attribute to adrenal fatigue are very real. And I don't need to diminish anyone's experience. I'm not suggesting that the symptoms aren't real and the effects of it aren't real. I'm suggesting that the proposed mechanism or the explanation of those symptoms, which is that the adrenals are exhausted or fatigued and can't produce cortisol, there's no research to support that idea. Really, we know that it's mostly about the brain. The brain is the primary regulator of cortisol production, and in the vast majority of people, the adrenals are perfectly able to produce cortisol. They're just not getting the right message from the brain. And then there are also tissue-specific regulatory mechanisms that impact the bioavailability of cortisol and the ability of cortisol to activate to enter the cells and do all the things that it's supposed to do, that can change and shift in inflammatory conditions, which of course pretty much every modern chronic disease involves. And so I think it's a much more complex problem than has typically been understood in the kind of functional or integrative or alternative medical worlds. And that explanation caught on because it's simple. It's easy to understand. It kind of fits with people's own experience and narrative of their symptoms. And it's a much catchier term than my term for this condition, which is HPA axis dysregulation. So I just don't see that catching on like adrenal fatigue. But I'm seeing I am seeing people using that term. So something's happening.
Yeah, there's definitely people using HPA axis dysregulation. There's one more layer I want to mention, which is I've actually looked very extensively at the research on, since there's nothing on adrenal fatigue, on related conditions like stress-related exhaustion disorder, burnout syndrome, vital exhaustion. There's a few different terms that this goes by, but basically chronic stress leading to fatigue and exhaustion. There's research on that, and there's research on it specifically looking at whether there is any sort of cortisol or even HPA axis abnormality. And actually, the vast majority of those studies conclude that most people with burnout syndrome or stress-related exhaustion disorder have perfectly normal cortisol levels that are indistinguishable from healthy people. So I personally, I actually don't necessarily even think, while HPA axis dysfunction is certainly going on in many people, I don't think you can make a case that it's the primary cause of those conditions.
I think I would agree with that for the most part, but I think the problem is how cortisol is being assessed in some of those studies, and then whether things like cortisol resistance are being considered, which is where, just like any other insulin resistance, where you have adequate levels of cortisol, but the cells have become resistant to it because of the inflammatory cascade. And that's been shown to happen in acute infectious illnesses. And it's a body's protective mechanism to prevent being harmed by the upregulation of cortisol that's chronic over time. So I wouldn't necessarily dismiss cortisol from the equation just yet. And I think it does play a role, especially when you get into the nitty gritty and you compare free cortisol levels with metabolized and total cortisol levels, and you use urine assessment to look at cortisol metabolites in addition to saliva and serum when it's appropriate. But I would agree that in many cases, there's something else going on that's not explicitly caused by the HPA axis. It might be more the sympatho-adrenal medullary system, for example, which is the part of our stress response that tends to be more impacted by trauma and certain aspects of the modern lifestyle. So I think there's a lot we still don't understand about it. But the good news is that a lot of the interventions that would be recommended for HPA axis dysregulation are those that will also help burnout syndrome and whatever we want to call it. You as a consumer or just a person, you don't need to necessarily understand the mechanism perfectly to know what you need to do about it. And that's a message I often like to remind patients of when I like going down these rabbit holes, and I can see that you do too, but you don't have to become an expert in these mechanisms to know how to respond in an appropriate way.
Right. Whether HPA axis dysfunction is the primary cause or not, we still know that sleep and circadian rhythm and de-stressing and good nutrition and movement and all those things.
Sunlight and being outdoors and social connection and support and play and fun. That's what is so encouraging to me. And so, with all this stuff, it's like it always comes back to the basics in terms of the levers that we can actually push on as individual human beings. The other stuff is fun. Like, it's just fun for me to understand those mechanisms and geek out and all that. But at the end of the day, it really just comes down to the choices we make and the behaviors that we engage in on a daily basis that drive our health.
100%. I think that's the perfect way to end. I know you got to run right now. Chris, this has been an absolute pleasure. I would love to talk with you for 3 more hours. I feel like this went by way too fast, but thank you so much for the time. And
Thank you,
where
Ari.
can people follow, learn more about what you do and get a hold of your work, and where do you want to send people?
Great. Yeah. ChrisKresser.com is my main website. Everything's there. Social media, where you can find me on social media, lots of free stuff. And if you're interested in training, that would be KresserInstitute.com. And thanks for having me. I've enjoyed this conversation.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, it's been a pleasure. And I highly recommend everybody look into functional medicine and Chris Kresser's work and his functional medicine training program. So thank you again so much, Chris. And I look forward to doing another session with you sometime soon.
Great. I like that. Take care.
Cool.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye. Hey there, this is Ari again. One more quick thing before you go. Just make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Energy Blueprint, and also make sure to subscribe to this podcast on your favorite podcast platform, whether that's iTunes or Stitcher or anything else. I hope you guys enjoyed this interview, and I will see you again next week.